All right, hi. Welcome to the monthly OutMatch webinar series. I'm your host, Dan Houts. OutMatch delivers the data that's missing from your hiring process. With clear, measurable insight into candidates and new hires, you'll make better hiring decisions, and your organization will finally be able to measure the impact of hiring on your company. If you have questions during this webinar, you can certainly type them into the GoToWebinar queue or tweet them to @OutMatchHCM with the hashtag hiring analytics, and we will get that. We'll address all questions at the end of the presentation. So just remember @OutMatchHCM and the hashtag hiring analytics. I'm very excited to introduce today's presenter, Carol Jenkins, the Chief Analytics Officer here at OutMatch. Carol's got over 20 years of experience working with Fortune 500 companies in such areas like selection assessment, process design, development for leadership, all that good stuff. She's also a licensed industrial organizational psychologist. We've also got Casey Johnson with us, who is an important member of our team as a PhD senior scientist, R&D specialist. So without further ado, Carol?
Thanks, Dan. Well, I'm really excited to be here as well this afternoon, and Casey and I are going to discuss something pretty important in terms of hiring, which is really measuring your analytics and understanding the impact you're having on your business. And we're going to narrow that down to about 8 key metrics that we find in working with our customers is the most important thing to track, and talk to you a little bit about what they mean, how you track them, and how you can potentially change some levers to actually have a good impact and improve on your metrics. But first let's talk a little bit about human resources and how it's changing and how all these metrics and all this data is really having an impact in terms of how to become more strategic as someone who works in HR. How do you become strategic to your business? So as most of you have probably been familiar in the years around human resources. Generally, initially with human resources, they were seen more as compliance or police officers in terms of making sure people followed rules and things were being done. Well, that is shifting pretty dramatically in terms of a more strategic focus. We know that, and organizations know that talent is their most critical asset. That talent is also a pretty expensive cost to an organization, so labor costs can really have a big impact on the business. But the real shift that's happened probably in the past few years is this whole focus on analytics and having technology more available to us and the ability to track all pieces of an entire selection process, employee life cycle, really gives us a lot more information about the candidate and the hire once they're on board. So today, more than ever, analytics is making it really possible for HR to have a seat at the table with the leaders to talk about how they can transform their business and how they can really make an impact to the bottom line. So I mentioned big data and how important analytics is becoming, and it's really important at every step of the process, whether it's the candidate experience and understanding, what aspects of that experience are causing particular disturbances to your hiring process, where are those candidates dropping off, to the pre-screen assessments you might use to understand candidates and the quality they might have and how they fit your jobs best. On the back end, once they're hired, what is it in terms of their success? How do we measure their effectiveness? And really the 2 areas on the front end, which we'll talk about today as well, is your even employment brand today. How is that working? How are candidates viewing you in the market? There's so many social media apps out there that can really give you a good measure around your employment brand. And then sourcing is another key step. So all these key areas within the hiring process really will drive different results as we start to analyze the data that we get to help us make better decisions and really improve our entire selection process. An interesting fact is since last year, 4.4 million jobs have been created in the space of talent analytics. So it's a really important hotspot for HR. So when we talk about analytics and measurement, the first step is to really understand what we're measuring and what we need to be measuring. And so when we think about a selection process, it has to begin with, what does success look like in the job? What does successful selection look like? And what are those metrics that we want to measure to understand if we are being successful? So question is for everyone on the phone, as we'll have some polls throughout, but can you measure what you want to measure is really important. How often are you able to capture that data? And then how will you evaluate that data to your existing results? So are you actually measuring it against a goal that is, based on your existing internal metrics, like where you were last year on this, or an external metric, like how you compare to others in the industry? So one thing I do here is we've got tons of data, but what do we do with it? The data is not really useful unless we know how to measure it and then make changes based on that. So let's talk about the 8 key metrics to improving hiring efficiency. So some of these will be familiar to you, things like time to fill, cost to acquire a candidate, what your applicant quantity is like, your applicant flow, your offer to acceptance ratio. So you might have a ton of applicants and some really good ones, but they're not accepting your job, so it's a critical piece. Your compliance and adoption of your selection process is critical for success. One that's kind of new and becoming more and more important is this onboarding engagement. So I'm not talking about long-term engagement, but really within the first 90 days, did we do a good job to onboard that candidate? We'll talk about diversity and adverse impact, so making sure that we're not discriminating against any particular group in our selection process. And then finally, a big one, which is quality of hire. So we're going to go through each one of these and talk through what they mean and how you measure them and how you can improve them. So let's look at the first one here, which is time to fill. And this really represents the number of days from when the job requisition was opened until the offer was accepted by the candidate. And so you look across all your hires and you get an average time to fill. So why is this an important metric? Well, if your time to fill is way too long, that can have a big impact on your business. For one, you're going to lose great candidates that may really be effective employees. And so if you frustrate candidates early on, you potentially will lose them from your process, and that can create a big problem. The other element of it is opportunity lost, which is having too many applicants or too many positions opened, and you have morale within the business because they're doing so much extra work. So really having this shortened is a big important piece in terms of your metrics. So unfortunately, what we've seen over the past few years is that this actually has increased by 10.3 days. And this study is, when you think about since 2010, this is a Glassdoor study, a recent study. Since 2010, it's actually gotten worse. And if you think about technology, should have really been helping us get hires in the door quicker, right? So they can apply online. They don't have to come into the restaurant or the store to actually apply in person. So something is creating a little bit of a delay here, and it can be really a lot of things, but particularly some of the things might be that your process is now so all your applicants coming in, there's so many more that it's making it very difficult for hiring managers to sift and sort through that and actually make a decision about a hire quickly. Another kind of interesting metric that we want to talk about is when you don't fill a job within that first month, unfortunately what happens is it's likely going to stay open for the remainder of the quarter. And so again, the quicker you can fill that job, the more efficient you can be, then the more likely you're going to have somebody employed, and you're not going to create problems where recs are open for more than 90 days. So that becomes pretty problematic and can really have a big impact on the business, whether it's loss of revenue to the business because they don't have enough people, the quality of service. All those things are impacted if you don't have enough people within the business. So we're going to do a little poll. Casey's going to walk us through this poll real quick.
All right, we're going to launch our first poll of the day. This one is, what is your time to fill the position?
Okay.
And so there we have our responses of the first 30 days, the general 31 to 60 days, over 61 days, or if you don't really have an idea of how long it's taking you to hire most of your positions.
All right, so we're going to leave this poll open for a few minutes. We've got probably about 75% of attendees completing it. Okay, so we've had it open for about 30 seconds. So let's see. Whoops. Okay, can you see?
All right, so our general results are most people are taking over 60 days to end up filling a position, and then followed closely by the 30 to 60 day range, and the don't know is about 25%. So a lot of people are having that problem of having open positions, and then it just carries over month to month.
Yep.
What do you think about that, Carol?
Yeah, I do think that, you know, what we're seeing kind of what the data says, and so really having time to fill fixed is an important piece. So let's talk a little bit about what you could do to improve your time to fill, and also understand what are those factors that are playing into that. So some of the factors, you know, I know from my clients that I work with, sometimes the actual job itself can be very difficult to fill. So if it's a job where you don't have a lot of applicants applying in those positions, or it's a very specific or unique skill set, that makes it very difficult to recruit and close those jobs. So that will definitely play a factor, and I would consider that a factor that you can't control. Location, you know, if you have locations in very rural areas where your applicant pool is not that large, that also plays into that. Unemployment rates. So with unemployment rates, you know, being low, not having a lot of applicants out there looking for jobs, that also can create a problem. But let's talk about the factors you can control. So some of those factors are things like technology, right? So creating hurdles for your applicants that really frustrates them. So that could be a long application process. That could be certain things within your questions in your application that will either turn off an applicant or be very difficult for them to answer. Those are key things that will impact it, as well as having too many interviews. So if they have to go through many steps, you can't get them all done quickly, that can definitely impact your time to fill. And then also just your, you know, what are the comps that you're offering, what are your benefits, what are your salary, all those things will also impact the time to fill. So in terms of improving that, you know, one thing I would always suggest is to go into your process and take your application. Get a feel for what it's like. Look at what are those things that are candidate distractors. Do you require candidates to have certain types of passwords to access your system? You know, are there problems around those passwords that make it very difficult for people to get in and to, if they forget it, to reset? Those are kind of critical things. The length of your application. If you have 30 clicks to get through your application, that is way too long. You should look to 2 to 3 pages of questions, and that's it. And look for ways to really make it more simplified. So I know that sometimes applications for like an hourly employee might require them to upload a resume. Well, you shouldn't do that for hourly populations. So there's all types of things that can really impact, and if you go in with, you know, looking at it from that candidate perspective, you're likely to be able to see some areas where you can make some improvements. The other piece is accessibility for all populations. We'll talk a little bit about mobile here in a minute, but you know, when you have application process and it's not accessible to the populations you're hiring in, that's a problem. So maybe it is that you know, before they used to be able to walk into your store and complete the application. So how do you make that process easier for them today, especially if they might not have access to a computer. So whether it's directing them to a library, giving them, you know, a laptop or an iPad in your location for them to complete it, those are all things that can help you improve your time to fill. The other thing to think about is, let's say you have reference checking as part of your process. There's absolutely some things around reference checking that can automate the ability to get data back from references much quicker. There's some online reference checking tools that allow you to do this automation, and we can certainly share information with you about that. Minimize your interview process, or actually have them all happen on one day. Making sure that when your hiring managers are actually reviewing applicants, they have the ability to filter, sort, screen on some job requirements, as well as certain shift requirements and things like that. So having technology to really help that hiring manager understand the data, make sense of the data, and make decisions quickly. And then finally, the last thing on there to think about is, what's your offer process look like? Is it slow? Does it take a long time? Does it require additional hurdles? Those are all things to consider in terms of improving your time to fill. Okay, let's take the next metric, which is cost to acquire. So cost per hire has face validity outside of HR because it's understood and accepted by line managers as a form of recruitment effectiveness. So what does that mean? That means that cost to hire, you know, business people understand that. They understand that if it's too expensive to hire people, that's a problem. If we look at what the average cost of a hire in 2014 by Deloitte, they were saying it's around $4,000. So what goes into that cost to acquire formula? So there's some external things as well as some internal things that impact us. So external things, it really depends again on your role. If we're talking about an hourly role, you're not going to probably have a lot of recruiting costs, but you may have like temp agency costs, or if you have a staffing agency that's helping you source those candidates, those are all external costs. The cost to actually advertise and market and try to get applicants to apply are external costs. Some of the internal costs are things like your cost to review resumes, review applications, to do interviews. Another external cost, not necessarily on here, is pre-employment assessments. And then also internally, if there's an employee referral program. So all of these things go into the factor of what it's going to cost me, and then I'm going to divide that by the total number of hires. Keep in mind, you know, there are absolutely, these variables might shift. I don't usually like to put training costs in here, and there may be different ways that your organization measures this, but generally this is what we see as how you might want to calculate your cost to acquire. Now what we're going to do is another poll.
All right, this one we're going to look at, try to get you engaged here. What is your cost per hire for most of your hourly roles? And so these vary from under 1,000, 1,000 to 5,000, 5,000, 10,000, 10,000 or more, or this something that you really don't look at for most of your roles. And we've got about half of them answered now.
We'll let it run for about another 8 minutes or so. Seconds. Thanks, Casey.
Poll.
All right, we'll go ahead and close it and launch it. Share it.
All right. So most of the people are not measuring what the cost is to hire hourly employees, and those that are say it's about 1,000 to 5,000.
Okay, so pretty in line with what that metric said, and I think again on this one, it has a lot to do with the level of employee that you're hiring. You know, if you think about a professional job, just even having like a recruiter or some other agency help you fill that job, that's going to cost you a lot. What I will say though on this is 70% of you don't know, so that's a definite important thing to go back to the business and try to calculate so that you can really understand the impact that that's having and where you might want to make some of those changes. So let's talk a little bit about that. So how can you improve your cost to acquire? Well, really, I think you can control both internal and external things. So from an internal perspective, Some of the ways that organizations have done this is to centralize recruiting so that they can focus certain recruiters on the same roles for high volume jobs. So they're able to maybe source for 5 or 6 different locations, but they're working from that same applicant pool and they're nurturing that applicant pool. So they'll have a lot more ability to, if the person doesn't fit for this one job, they can put them into a different job. So centralizing recruiting can definitely help that. Minimizing interview time. So looking at ways to do that, whether it's using something like video interviewing, where you actually get a couple minutes of a candidate prior to actually seeing them live in person. And this might allow you to do a little bit of pre-screening beforehand. So for example, we have an assessment that will help kind of minimize, the applicant pool based on some personality and behavioral traits, but we also ask a couple questions that are more interview-based at the end of it. And so what a recruiter can then do is their normal next step would have been to do a phone call with them, which might be a 30-minute phone call if they didn't have that video interview in place. And every candidate then would require 30 minutes of their time to do interviews. With a video recorded report where you can actually look at that candidate's response, what you'll end up being able to do is potentially just spend a few minutes, make sure that candidate is fitting, or there's not anything that really is kind of knocking them out, and quickly go through a couple of those videos and make a decision. They don't have to sit through the entire 30 minutes like they would if the person was right in front of them. At that point, however, it's absolutely necessary, I think, to do a live interview with people. And if you do end up using video interviewing, there's some caveats around that. But that's one way, that we've seen our client that they were able to, be able to improve one of their metrics, which was interview to offer ratio. Before the pilot with us, it was about 29%. Now they're at 52%. So really helped improve the interviews that they got in by using that as a pre-screen at the front end. The other external costs are things like looking at your sources. How are you sourcing? Are you using things like Indeed or Monster, or whatever all the job boards are today? Are there specific ones that are more effective than others? And so really kind of leveraging those, and hopefully those are also cost effective in terms of making a decision as to how you want to spend your dollars. Pre-screening tools also help you enable you to prioritize based on job fit, so that minimizes your funnel again. So that's another way to really get to a better quality applicant, so you're not spending time with those that are a poor fit. Okay, let's go to the next metric, which is applicant quantity. And when we talk about applicant quantity, it's really not quality, but it's more about how many candidates start your application process and complete it, right? So, one of the questions, we're not going to ask this today, but I'd be curious to know, is how many of your applicants actually drop off, and if you know what your drop-off rates are. So in order to calculate your applicant quality, you do need to know what your drop-off is. So what is your applicants that you have coming in, number of applicants, minus your drop-off, divided by your total number of hires. And so we're going to do a poll, but our poll is going to not be in terms of your overall ratio there, but we want to know what is your applicant flow per hire for hourly jobs. So if you were to hire one person, how many applicants would you actually need?
Yeah. And so our option,
sorry.
Yeah.
Or not need, but see, right?
Yeah. How many people are applying for your job for each one that you're going to end up hiring? And so is it less than 3? Are we having 4 or 5, 6 to 10, or are you having 11 more for each job that you're hiring for? We've had about half of you answer so far. We're doing pretty good here. Get a few more seconds and let the last of them answer. All
right, we'll go ahead and close it and share it here.
All right. half of you said that it's taken 11 or more applicants before you can have one hire. And then we have 20% that don't quite measure that, and then another 20% that think 4 or 5 for each hire that they have.
Yep. So what does that mean? Is that a bad thing to have more applicants? Not necessarily. What we find in some jobs where the time to fill is really hard, you want to have a pretty good applicant flow, especially if you have tools in place to help you kind of screen through that and really find the best quality candidates. I would say, there was about 20% of you said 4 to 5 applicants per hire. What we generally find is that at the hourly level, if you're using an applicant tracking system, you generally are above 10 hires per applicant. 10 applicants per hire. If you are looking at a professional managerial job where your process requires you to invite them to the next phases of the process, most of them actually could apply online. So if you were just looking at those jobs, it would be a smaller number, similar to that 4 to 5. So I'm curious in the audience, the ones that picked the 4 or 5 per hire were more professional jobs versus the hourly, or maybe they just didn't have an applicant tracking system in place. Yep. Okay. So when we look at this, one of the things that we like to look at is how do our clients compare against each other to really understand what is their applicant flow by store. And so you could do this by position or by hire. What we asked for was by hire. But if you look at what you're supposed to, if you have a store or a restaurant that has 50 employees, you might only need to hire maybe 5 to 10 jobs that month for that particular store. But what's your applicant flow for that store? And so we use things like this comparable where we say across other similar organizations, some might be really, really large. They might have 1,000 locations, and some might only have 5. But if we look at how many applicants apply divided by the number of stores you have, you can do a comparison across businesses, different types of companies, to give you an idea of what your applicant flow is going to look like. Things to think about when you're looking at what your actual quantity is looking like is, do you have diverse applicant pools? So also comparing yourself against other companies in similar industries to see if they have a very similar demographic. Employment branding also really can have an impact as well. So I talked a little bit earlier about Glassdoor and some of the reputation that you might have as a business. What we've found is you tend to get much higher applicant flow when you have a company that's well known. A lot of people want to work there. If you're a little bit more of an unknown, you have to spend a little bit more dollars in terms of sourcing to get applicants in the door. There's also, a lot of applications will ask applicants where they came from, and that's not what we find to be a really reliable source. So you may want to instead ask your technology team to be able to do some tracking on how people are coming in. Like, are they coming in from certain job boards or certain marketing campaigns that you might have done? That will help you also determine what's the best approach in terms of improving your quantity of your applicants. Interesting things that we see, if you think about professional or managerial jobs, when you have recruiters that really kind of bond with those candidates and have some more kind of one-on-one time, they tend to stay engaged. They don't leave your process. And so again, that's one way that you can impact the quantity and at the end of the day how you fill those candidates, those jobs. That's an important thing to look at. The other thing to think about is, what are some issues that lead to losing of this big applicant flow? So what are some things that are impacting the drop-off that you might be seeing? So comparing drop-off, I know a minute ago we just kind of looked at that in a different chart, but and that was more flow. Now we're going to look at drop-off, as you can see over here on the right side of the screen. If you look at what is expected for an assessment of this particular length or an application of this particular length, what is our expected applicant drop-off? And within the process of our applicant tracking or our selection process, where do we see drop-off happening? Do we see it happening in the first part of the application? If we have an assessment, do we see it happening within the assessment? If I capture WOTC, is it happening at that phase? You know, where is drop-off actually happening in the process is important, but then also measuring how you compare to others with similar processes. So, you know, the other thing to think about too is your actual technology solution. So if you do have an applicant tracking system, one of the things that's really pretty simple that you may or may not have happening in your process today is what's called inline versus pop-up. So let's say you have a component within your applicant tracking system like a background check or a WOTC or an assessment, whatever it might be. If you have an integration with another vendor within that applicant tracking system, usually it just refreshes the page and that new vendor's data or questions show up. If a pop-up happens instead on the computer versus just doing it within, refreshing within that same page, you end up seeing about a 30% difference in terms of drop-off rates at that point. So those are important things to think about. The other important one to think about is, again, we talked about length, right? If it's too long, that creates a problem. And then accessibility here comes into play as well. And so let's just do a little quiz to see what you guys think about mobile accessibility and how that might impact quantity. And we're going to take an example of like a restaurant, okay? And just to explain, some restaurants have what's called front of house roles. That would be like your servers, your host, those kinds of things. Yep. And then heart of house is your other typical job that you see there. So let's launch this one. Casey, you want to walk them through the poll?
Yeah. So we're really getting at here. How do you think mobile impacts your quantity of applicants? So do you think it won't impact it? Do you think it's going to increase the number of applicants by about 20%? Do you think front of house roles are 10% more likely to use it than back of house, or do you think back of house is 10% more likely to use it than front of house?
Or do you think B and C are correct, right? So it increases applicant flow, but the ones that you really see the impact on is your front of house jobs, or does it increase applicant flow, but you see the impact being more at your back of house jobs? And so your back of house jobs are things like cooks and things like that.
We've had about half the people vote so far. We'll give it a few more seconds. This one was a little wordy, so it's a little harder to get through.
It's a little confusing, but I think there's some really good, interesting points on this one. That's why we wanted to kind of split it out this way, because it kind of shifts some of the your biases or your expectations that you might see.
Yeah.
Okay, so we ready?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, let's share it.
All right, so we've had about 63% of people say that it's going to increase the applicant flow by 20%. 47% think that it's going to increase front of house roles more than it will the back of house roles. And then another 16% of people think that back of house roles are going to increase more so than front of house.
Okay, so
everybody seemed to agree that it's going to increase your applicant flow. That's a good sign.
Yes, and you know what? You guys are right about that, but I think the interesting thing that I learned in this process was actually a little bit different. Let me hide this and show you again. So we are seeing an increase when people are using mobile, that their application flow jumps to about 20% higher than it was before mobile. But the really cool, interesting one is back of house roles, which are things like the cook, the dishwasher, those that have, if you think about it, are probably more diverse applicant populations that you would think don't have computers. They tend to use at a 10% higher rate mobile to complete applications. So not only is it going to help you to increase your applicant flow, but it will probably help you in sourcing some of those more difficult jobs to get on mobile quicker. So I think that was a really interesting thing that we've seen in our data, because many times HR people will tell us, well, you know, technology is just, it's a struggle. Our heart of house people, they might not be able to get to. Our back of house people may not be able to, understand technology as much. We don't want to limit it. Well, you're actually seeing the reverse effect here. Somebody did ask what was our completion rate for our assessments. I did have that as an example on some of the slides before. So we generally see from a completion rate perspective that they get completed probably around, it depends on the length of the assessment. Hourly jobs is around 95% completion once they're in the assessment itself. And then management jobs, what's tricky, the professional level jobs, what's tricky about those is depending on where they're placed in the process. So as I mentioned before, if I've got a recruiter that's calling them and inviting them to take the assessment, you can see drop-off as little as 1%, to like about 3 to 4%, even if the assessment is like an hour to 30 to 40 minutes to complete. So length of assessment has less to do with that. It's more the bond they have with the recruiter that helps them from dropping off. But however, if you have no touch with a recruiter and it's part of the application system, length of assessment does make an impact. So usually our manager professional assessments are a little bit longer. We might see about a 10% drop-off, where our shorter hourly assessments are more like a 5% drop-off. So that's a great question. Okay, let's go to how we can really kind of work with the quantity and improving the quantity. So key thing is, and when our clients come to us and they say, look, we're having a really hard time in this part of the country, they're saying that the technology is impacting their ability to hire people. We'll look at the data and we'll say, well, when they were having people walk in and apply for jobs, they were seeing maybe 5 or 6 applicants. Now they're seeing hundreds of applicants. So your applicant pool is not shrinking, but what happens is at that level in those, I think one of the best approaches is to really help that hiring manager in that location or that recruiter really nurture your candidate pools. Be able to think about if they applied to another job down the road within your company, how do you make sure you have access to that applicant pool as well and be able to kind of use them for these other jobs. So nurturing the candidate pools, even if the applicant wasn't selected at one time, going back and kind of keeping in touch with them, that's an important piece. There's some creative ways of sourcing to help you get more applicant flow. Things like the automated referencing that I talked about, the reference checking I talked about before, is a good way to actually ask all the references that are provided by that applicant if they would be interested in working for you. So that's a nice way to get to passive applicants, and we can certainly tell you a little bit more about that if you're interested. Have targeted sourcing, use of employee referral programs, all those things are great things to do in terms of improving quantity. And then also looking outside your industry to see if there's maybe other industries that have transferable skills that you can tap into. So I hear this a lot with with retail versus restaurant. Can those two types of jobs do they have similar skill sets that we can pull from that applicant pool as well and really try to source in that area. All right, we are going to go to offer to acceptance ratio. This is another one. I think the rest of these go a little quicker, so we should get through them a little faster. But here it's basically looking at, evaluating the success of your recruitment program is how successful it is at getting your candidate once that offer has been extended. So are they actually accepting your offer? And so when you look at the metrics around how you do that, it's really how many offers were accepted divided by the total candidates that were offered employment multiplied by 100. And so things that impact this are things like the job market, right? So if there's not many people on the job market and lots of jobs, that's going to impact it. Understanding what your compensation is compared to others. If you're really underpricing or paying your employees or your hires, that's going to play a huge factor. What is your review, your company review? Are your past employees really speaking highly of your company? So it's kind of like, Glassdoor is like a Yelp for employment, right? To really understand if this is the right company you want to work with. So really that general reputation, your employment brand, compared to your competition is a critical piece. So in terms of solutions to improve this, really thinking about, again, of those that are actually accepting my positions, are they coming in from a particular source? What we find is that usually referrals tend to provide a really good offer to acceptance ratio because they know somebody that's worked there, that person's vouched for your company, and that's an important key factor there. It's important to also understand from your candidates at the front end of the process what's important to them in terms of the offer. So knowing that, being able to kind of be proactive around that is an important factor, that maybe you can adjust the offer a little bit based on what this candidate has told you. You know, when you sell the offer or you sell the company to them, you know, talking to them about it not just being a salary, but all these other pieces of their compensation, or maybe it's something very unique about the job, their growth opportunities. So again, knowing what's important to them and then being able to position some of these kind of benefits to them is a key thing. And then one thing that's probably not done very often is, you know, once you have a candidate that rejects an offer, is to go back and really do a debrief, like try to understand what it was. Was it another job that came in? Was it that it took too long? Was it that they met the manager and they weren't happy with who they would be working for? You know, what are the key things that really created that disconnect for that candidate? You also should look at this by recruiter as well to see if certain recruiters are having a higher offer to acceptance ratio, and see what they might be doing that's different that can be a best practice for everyone else to do. Okay, so compliance and adoption, that's another kind of key factor that we want to look at. Here it's a lot about consistency in your process so that you're fair, and every applicant gets a really similar process. So if we look at compliance, you know, what are the key things here? You know, across applicants, for one position, it's important that the selection requirements be consistent and with minimal to no exceptions. So it's super important from a legal defensibility standpoint to ensure that your applicant's experience is not varying very much. And if somebody, for example, does not pass a component of your hiring process, that they're not getting an exception done by them, right? So for example, if you say that they need to have certain basic job requirements, but yet we end up hiring a few people that didn't meet those job requirements, that ends up creating a potential problem in the future for your selection process. If you do use assessments, which I think they're very, very common nowadays, one of the things that you need to ensure is that they're valid. And validity is not just that the vendor told you they were valid, but that you have documentation that really lays out the validation around the tool. If you need more information on that too, we can share with you like what should be included in a validation report, so that you guys can make a safe decision around that. The other piece of compliance, and this is a little bit of your adoption and buy-in, right? Did you have applicants skip any portion of the hiring process? So did a manager put that applicant through and make the job offer without them going through certain steps? Were there any hires who failed the assessment, but yet they were still hired, right? So those are things that, again, puts you a little bit at legal risk, and also really kind of jeopardize the buy-in, the long-term buy-in of the assessment overall, or the application process steps that you might have. So how do you improve it? One is measure, right? You measure of your hires, do you have all the selection components completed on those hires? And if there's something missing, find out why. If you have somebody who took let's say that you have an assessment as part of your process, and you go back and you say, okay, tell me all my hires, how many of them, you know, were red, yellow, or green on the assessment? Okay, well, I had 5 reds. Why do I have 5 reds? Let me go and find out which recruiters allow these reds to get through, and really kind of explain to them the reasons behind consistency, compliance, and understand that. Many times you have to go back and re-educate why we have certain pieces of the process in there and demonstrate the ROI of those processes so that people are bought in, they understand why it's important to use them. And then finally, to keep your process up to date, because as the business changes, you know, if you have, for example, an assessment in place and it's 20 years old, your job is probably not the same as it was 20 years ago, even 5 years ago in some cases. So making sure that you've refreshed that, that the assessments are still valid or whatever process is still valid, and ensure that you're not creating any issues there. Okay, let's talk about the next one, which is onboarding engagement. And this is new hire engagement and reacceptance of the position. So generally measured early in the hiring process, less than 90 days. So it's key to look at a couple things here. I would say try to get objective measures if you can. Turnover is a quick measure to tell you if the person was onboarded well and was having a good experience. If they leave within the first 90 days, something's wrong. Other ways that you can ask this is by doing little surveys of your hires once they're on board, asking them things about, you know, would they reaccept the job? Was the job exactly what they thought it was going to be? Are they happy in the job? You know, do they like their manager? Those are things that you can start to get information on and then be able to tweak your selection process. Maybe your recruiters need to do some slightly different things to explain the job differently to candidates. And then also looking at, you know, the success from the training program, right? So a lot of times people will quit within the training process. That's another area where you want to make sure you minimize, right, if there are people quitting within that process. Maybe they didn't get the training they expected. They need a little bit more reinforcement before they get put on the job. So key things around solutions here. First, begin to measure it. Again, it's fairly new, I think, for people to be looking at this. You know, so and ways to actually start improving it is look at your hiring process, see if your recruiters are providing a realistic job preview to candidates. Maybe you need to let the candidates experience the role a little bit, especially if they don't have experience in that type of job. I would say one of the places we see a lot of poor onboarding engagement is call centers, especially with people who have never worked in call center jobs. You know, those are factors to consider. Look at somebody's experience in this industry, and then did they quit really quick if they had no experience? Was it because they really didn't know what they were getting into? And so one of the ways to fix that is to have your recruiters really explain the job, let them get experience in that role. Other factors are managers creating dissatisfaction, barrier in training. You know, there's a lot of sometimes really stringent rules around days they can miss during training. So really kind of understanding that and making sure that that candidate has you have a clear expectation being given to them about what they need to do in terms of training. And then also looking at, you know, is there a correlation between training and job success, right? So if they're not really set up for success, are they quitting? Are they performing so poorly that then they leave the organization? Mentioned a little bit, one of the other metrics is diversity and adverse impact. So ensuring, and when I talk about diversity, it means that I have, you know, a representative group of people applying for this job. That's what I would expect in my applicant pool, and that I haven't created anything in my selection process that's going to discriminate against those groups. So for example, if I have, you know, if I'm in a real rural area and, you know, people don't have a lot of technology and now my entire selection process is technology based, am I only really focusing in on the young population because they're the ones that are familiar with technology, or maybe the rich population because they all have technology, whatever it might be? You kind of need to think about what parts of your process might potentially create issues for certain demographic groups. If you don't know because you don't collect demographic information, that's not an excuse. You have to be able to collect it to be able to measure it and to be able to ensure that you're not creating a disadvantage to any type of minority group. So what can you do? One is really tracking it, right? Making sure that nothing is impacting your demographic groups. You can do a comparison to others in your industry, others in your market, to try to see if the applicant pools look similar. You also can do some things to really boost some of your diversity. So whether it's with military or applicants with disabilities, those are all things that can help improve your diversity numbers and also ensure that you've got applicants that are being treated fairly. All right, quality of hire. This is my last one. We got about 10 more minutes left, but probably the most important one here. So hiring for quality is fundamentally different than just filling positions. To do it right, you have to track performance metrics like quality of hire and return on investment. So let's talk about it. You know, once you have a good quantity, a healthy volume of applicants, you want to be able to screen and really look at who you're hiring within that applicant pool and identify those that are going to be the best quality. And so you want to do this in a way that doesn't increase your cost to hire or your time to fill, right? So if you have a super stringent process that's now, like for example, screening applicants at an 80% of your applicant rate, you've now created a problem with cost of hire and time to fill. So our recommendation is generally to have some kind of pre-screen assessment or something in place that's going to help you identify quality of hire and remove maybe about 20% of your applicants that are just a really bad fit for the job. And so assessments can help you in terms of understanding, you know, based on data that we see, if applicants that are hired score better on the assessment, you generally see some things like they tend to get up to speed quicker and start performing faster. And that's kind of what this example over here shows on the right. Over time, you still see that same trend, right? So that trend remains constant over time. So looking at once you've hired your people, how are they performing in terms of sales? What does their customer service scores look like? All those, whatever the key metrics are for the job, making sure you go back and look at, did the assessment really predict performance, and is it helping me look for people that are better suited for these roles? With that assessment data, once you feel you've got something calibrated really well to help you identify the best, that assessment data then allows you to prioritize candidates and then spend less interview cycles on those bad fits. So again, that really helps you with your time to fill as well as your cost of hire because you're now focusing on those better candidates. In terms of how you can improve your quality of hire, again, it's measurement, knowing what success looks like. So, you know, one of the key things about if you are using assessments, you really want to make sure that it is aligned to the roles that you're for. You wouldn't want to use an assessment that's service-based for applicants that have no access or they don't even face customers on a day-to-day basis. That would not be a good idea. You wouldn't be able to legally defend the use of it, and it's also helping you screen in people who might really hate the job because they're so service-oriented but they never see customers, right? So really tying it to the job is super important. Once you've got, in order to get the metrics that you need, you want to look at what kind of data is available to you to be able to see if they're a good hire. You know, so, and also understanding when they become a productive employee is important. So I wouldn't necessarily make all my judgments from, you know, looking at hires that have only been on the job for 90 days. It's really important to think about when they get through training, when they start getting productive, and then evaluate that over time. So maybe it's more like 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. It really depends on the job, how far out you want to wait before you can start looking at metrics. Again, those metrics can be things like service scores, sales scores, turnover. All of those different things can make an impact. And you really want to be looking at what is the correlation between whatever's in my selection process, whether it's assessments, or maybe it's your reference checks or your interviews. What is it that's really helping me predict who's going to be a top performer? If you're not already doing this today from an interview perspective, it would be really interesting to track interviews, maybe have your interviewers rate their interviewees that they're doing so that you can measure, you know, who they thought was going to be successful, who they thought was not going to be successful. But sometimes, the hiring manager will disagree, and you might hire somebody that was more moderate interviewer. And so to be able to go back and say, for this recruiter, they were really effective at interviewing, and they were able to really help us identify those high-quality hires. I think we'll be seeing a lot more of that and that data in terms of being able to track quality of hire on the back end. So just in summary, hopefully this was helpful in terms of the various metrics. It was a lot to get through in an hour. And I know, Dan, you want to potentially maybe, if there's any questions that came in, ask a couple questions while we still have a few minutes.
Yeah, definitely. A couple came in. One of them came in a couple times, maybe a couple different ways, but I think it's probably more important than the other if we can get to it first. Which of these metrics is most important to the business?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? So, you can say from a risk perspective, there's definitely some that are more problematic than others. So from a risk perspective, compliance and diversity are potential issues. From a bottom line to the business, I would say long-term quality of hire. If you can get ahead of the game and hire people that are better, that can perform better, that don't turn over, that's a really important metric to pay attention to, because it will reduce your costs associated with time to fill and cost to acquire as well. So I would say, depending on what quality of hire overall is probably the most important, but if you want to kind of avoid legal risk, then the diversity and compliance is also a key one.
Perfect. And that's good. We have time for one last question probably. It kind of backs up against that drop-off rate. So is drop-off really a bad thing? If they don't take 10 minutes for the assessment, do I really want them?
Yeah, so I think that if your drop-off rate is similar, and I'm getting an echo, Dan, I don't know if that's your phone. If your drop-off rate is around what we see that's normal for the industry for like hourly employees, you're going to have different drop-off rates throughout the process. So if they're dropping off in the application process, it's probably a little bit higher than what we see in our assessments. Our assessments, again, are only about 5 to 6% or so within a short assessment. And I think the question was if it's only a 10-minute assessment. So assuming that you're talking about the assessments, you don't, you mentioned you don't want people who can't even take the time to finish it. Yeah, absolutely. So if your drop-off rates are about 5 to 6%, then no problem. If they're like 30 to 40%, then it's a bigger problem. I do agree that if they don't even take the time to complete it, that's important. It's actually, very common across many organizations to get asked to complete a 10-minute assessment. If the assessment is an hour and a half long, that's a different story, right? That's probably too overkill for certain jobs, and that's where you might want to kind of scale it back. But I do think the argument is, as long as your metric on that is somewhat low, you should be okay. Because you're right, if they can't even spend 10 minutes, then it's probably not the best quality applicant. However, if my process was so difficult and it took so long and all these other factors come into play, then you may be losing good quality candidates. So where you should, when we look at actually using an assessment to pre-screen, that's different, right? That's like your screen out rate. In that case, you do want to have about that 20% screen out rate, and those candidates are more likely to be bad fits for your job. So I think there's value of having that assessment early on in the process, even though you might lose some candidates, because it gives you information about those really high quality candidates that you should be spending your time on. So I hope that makes sense.
It does.
Good answer.
That'll pretty much do it for us today. Thank you for joining us. We covered a lot of information, so please contact us at info@outmatch.com if you're interested in the slide deck. We've also recorded this, so we will have a link to our YouTube channel up shortly within the hour, so you can view it there as well. Also be a subscriber. We post a lot of great videos to help you through hiring much more efficiently. You can also find us on Twitter at OutMatchHCM. Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.